So I'm a photographer, Frank Relle. I was born in New Orleans and grew up here. I was really interested in revealing the cultural personality of the city that was revealed in the street side views of residential homes. I evacuated to Austin with some friends, and then watched Katrina hit on the news, and then was just in that place of figuring out my life, figuring out my family, if my house was okay, if my family's houses were okay, kind of where everybody was. I wasn't really thinking about photography until I left Austin and went to New York. I got in touch with my big mentor up there, Chris Callis. I moved into his house in Brooklyn, and but started showing him the pictures that I had been taking before Katrina. He introduced me to Charles Traub at the School of Visual Arts. He said, "Frank, you're telling the story of New Orleans and New Orleanians through these photographs that you're making of homes. And the homes of New Orleans and the homes of New Orleanians have been massively affected. They have a story to tell, and you have a way of telling it. So your project isn't over." At that point, I kind of thought my project was over. He said, "Your project isn't over, your project's just beginning. You got to get back to New Orleans and get back there quick and continue making these pictures." Being in New Orleans post-Katrina was like being in an ocean of a city. It was almost like the city was still submerged, but it was no longer submerged in water, it was submerged in darkness. My job was to express the feeling of New Orleans about what happened, and also to create a record of this change. The 10 images that we're going to be looking at show change in the most distinct way. I wonder if we should also look at 1 or 2 images that reveal lack of change, because that is part of the story. Like if we're telling the story for New Orleanians, or for complete understanding, maybe focusing on just the most radical change doesn't make sense. I think that there's a lot of romance in these buildings that are kind of falling down, that are cracking, but aren't kept up. And then now you see that someone's come and painted over that stucco, given it a new paint job. It's distinctly different, I think, with this coat of red paint on it. It covers up some of the imperfections, but it also covers up some of that history. This house here has been renovated into a new, very presentable condition, which is, when you drive around the Treme neighborhood now, you see that. The refrigerator became a symbol of Katrina, and for me it makes this photograph both compositionally but also what I'm talking about, because I'm talking about how things change and how visual symbols come to signify a place and time. You can see that there's still, in the photograph, there's still the leftover melted blue tarp that was on this roof. And then today, the old Cavalry Spiritual Church, which, you know, obviously is the counterpoint in this photograph of someone returning home and putting their refrigerator outside in the dark church, that's no longer here today. And that's what, when we come here and we see the car parked in its place, and the church has fallen down, it isn't there, that's one of the changes that we see 10 years after the storm. All 4 of these buildings have been completely renovated. After Katrina, this was an area that was pretty rough, but obviously someone has come in and maybe through the historic tax credit program, refurbished the buildings, and now we have them, they're intact. But they feel different, for sure. The landscape of a neglected building gives you an opportunity to imagine, you know, the people who used to live there, what happened, what stories there are. There's all kinds of Southern literature and movies that are tied up in those type of facades. And here you had these 2 buildings, this tiny little shotgun and this shotgun double, and then now they're not there anymore. We're in the lower 9th Ward now. This photograph that I call Cluet is at 1922 Lizardi Street. And It's a really important picture for me emotionally and how I felt about the loss that New Orleanians had after Katrina. It really resonated with all that, with all of the debris that's all piled up around it. And 10 years after, when we come here, there's no home in its place. It goes without saying, it's a very different neighborhood. It feels very different than it felt after Katrina. The first night that I snuck into the lower Ninth Ward, this was the shot that I set up. I turned down the street, and my headlights, shined on a house that was sitting in the middle of the street. It blocked the street off. You can see the telephone pole has been changed. The levee wall has been built. That's the wall that broke at the Industrial Canal that lifted the house up off the foundation and moved it into the middle of the street. After the storm, we go back to that simple A shape of a home, which is what I made here. And there was nobody living here. There was nothing going on around here. This house was kind of an icon in the neighborhood because it was this, spectacular old home with a staircase coming down. And there was a guy who lived here. Actually, he ran into me the night that I was making the photograph. It had this magic and mystery. It was this haunted house, in New Orleans. And we have seen, as we've gone around, that neglect has its romance, but at some point that romance falls and comes crashing down. And so, so here we have one that has been put back together, taken care of, and yeah, you can see the differences. You've got this beautiful historic home. It's well cared for and maintained, lit, painted. After Katrina, this area, although it was affected by wind events, it didn't flood. And so there's very little change. This image really came to represent a lot after Katrina because you had it right there, a life turned inside out. People's lives on the inside just ripped out and exposed to the elements. When we're kids and we draw a house, that shape, the roof line and the walls, that represents security, love, certainty, safety. The home is where our lives revolve around. When that is destroyed, when that is broken by whatever event, you can feel the pain of that, the human pain of that loss. I wanted to make something that sensitively gets to the heart of the matters of what it feels like to lose your home.